I called my cheating wife's lover while they were together. A mixture of anger and bitterness came over me. The words came out cold, calculated: tell her I'm getting a divorce. I could hear their breathing on the other end of the line, the heavy silence of someone who doesn't know what to do, but the decision had already been made. There was no going back. She tried. Tried to call me. Tried sending messages. He tried to justify the unjustifiable. But what else could I say? What could I hear that would change the fact that, in that moment, love had died? The nights she arrived late, the smiles she no longer offered me, the excuses, it all made sense now. I knew this day would come, but I never imagined it would be like this. So brutal. So definitive. The party was at a mutual friend's house. She didn't know I was going, much less that it would be the last time we would see each other as husband and wife. I went in, decided. The noise of the music, the laughter, the colorful lights that danced around the room, everything was a cruel contrast to the darkness I felt inside. I walked among the people, ignoring the conversations, the looks. I just wanted to get to her. Even both. I saw them before they saw me. They were together, laughing. They seemed unconcerned, oblivious to what was about to happen. It burned me inside. She was my wife, the woman I had promised to share my life with. How could she? And he, a mere spectator, an insignificant piece who had no idea what I had prepared. As I approached, time seemed to slow down. I saw them as if they were in slow motion, every gesture, every smile, and what irritated me most was that she didn't seem guilty. The guilt wasn't there. As if what they did was something natural, without consequences. But there would be consequences. Tell her I'm getting a divorce. The sentence echoed in the air, my voice firm, with no room for doubt. I watched her freeze. The laughter disappeared from his lips as if it had never existed. Her eyes widened, and then, despair. What are you doing here? She stuttered, her face pale, her expression shocked. I remained silent, watching as she tried to process what was happening. His hand was still on her arm, a touch that once might have been casual but now felt guilt-ridden. She tried to move away, but he remained there, confused, not knowing how to react. Wait, let me explain. It's not what you think. Her voice broke, the words coming out quickly, desperate. But there was nothing to explain. There was no excuse that could fix what was broken. What do you do when the world you knew just crumbles before your eyes? When the person you trusted most stabs you in the back? I didn't want to scream. I didn't want to cry. I wanted her to understand what she had done. I wanted her to feel the same emptiness that now filled every part of me. She kept talking, the words running over each other, but nothing made sense. No more. I no longer listened, I just watched. The fear in your eyes. The way she tried to justify the unjustifiable. The way he looked at me, uncertain, not knowing what to say. A heavy silence took over the three of us. He looked at her as if he expected her to figure it out, but she was lost. Let me explain, she repeated, as if there was still something to be said. I nodded, slowly. There were no more explanations. There were no more justifications. Everything that existed now was the end. And I wanted her to know that, I wanted her to feel every second of this pain. There is nothing to explain. My voice was low, but cutting. I already know everything. She tried to get closer, her eyes shining with tears that wouldn't change anything. Tears that, to me, seemed as fake as the excuses she was trying to formulate. Please. I made a mistake. I can fix this, we can fix this, her voice faltered, and for the first time, she seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. But it was already too late. I had lost nights of sleep, thinking about what I had done wrong, what was missing in me. Reliving every moment, every gesture, trying to find where I had failed. But now I knew it wasn't my fault. And that, more than anything, freed me. She couldn't stop talking, trying to convince me of something that even she didn't believe. Every word was a desperate attempt to erase what was already written, to change a destiny she chose herself. But what else could she say? What else could I hear that would erase the fact that, in that moment, love had died? Nothing. I had already made my decision. And that was the only certainty left. As she continued to despair, I realized something. That what mattered most now wasn't what she said or what she felt. What mattered was what I felt. And I didn't feel anything anymore. The emptiness had consumed everything. She looked at me, waiting for an answer, a chance. But I was no longer the same man she knew. The man who loved her, who would do anything for her, he was gone. In his place, there was someone who knew exactly what he wanted. And what I wanted was my freedom. When you get to the point where you no longer feel anything, there is nothing holding you back. Nothing that makes you want to continue. And I had reached that point. The moment when all words lose their meaning, and silence becomes the only answer. I left the party, leaving her behind with her explanations, her regrets and her empty promises. She was lost in a world she had created. And I was free. But, what she didn't know was that this divorce wouldn't just be a separation. There would be something more. Something she hadn't realized yet. Something that was about to change everything. What would she do when she discovered that the world she thought she knew was about to fall apart for real? What happens when what you fear most is not the end of your marriage, but the end of everything you've built? Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support any form of cheating. All the stories you hear are fictional, but they clearly show how betrayal destroys lives, families, and trust. Get ready, because what you are about to hear is an intense and shocking story that will stir your emotions. Enjoy the narrative and prepare for a dramatic and revealing journey. The clock on the wall said 7 p.m., but time seemed to drag by. John was sitting on the living room couch, with a glass of whiskey in his hand and his mind wandering. The house, which was once a haven of love and happiness, now seemed like just an empty scene. The silence was almost deafening. The television was on, but he was barely paying attention to the images playing on the screen. His mind was far away, lost in memories of years that seemed to have dissolved, like sand between his fingers. Melissa, his wife, had left early that morning, as usual. She had become increasingly distant over the past few months. The warm hugs, the quick kisses before work, the conversations at the dinner table, all of this seemed to belong to a distant past. John remembered how she used to wait for him at the door at the end of a long day of work. There was something comforting about that routine, the familiarity of always having her there. But lately, Melissa had transformed into someone he barely recognized. He still remembered when they met. She was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, with contagious energy and a lightness of spirit that enchanted everyone. Their laughter echoed through the hallways when he took her dancing in the city's bars. John used to say she lit up any room she walked into. His friends joked that he was lucky to have won her, and he believed it. He felt like the luckiest man in the world with her. In the beginning, marriage was all he ever wanted. They built a life together, overcoming the challenges that came their way. Melissa was his partner in everything. They shared dreams, plans, and ambitions. They discussed having children, traveling the world, growing old together. And for many years, it seemed like they were on track to accomplish it all. But, over time, small cracks began to appear. Nothing drastic at first, just subtle changes. Melissa started working more, staying out late, justifying herself with the new position she had taken on. John wanted to believe it was just the pressure of work. He himself spent long hours at the company, trying to expand his business. They had always been a strong duo, capable of facing anything together. However, something was different, something he couldn't identify clearly. Melissa had a more reserved demeanor, less enthusiastic about the things that used to make her smile. She no longer talked about her days with the same enthusiasm, and when John tried to get closer, she simply shut down. There was no longer that natural intimacy, the conversations that flowed effortlessly. Now every word felt like a silent battle, and the space between them grew, harder and harder to ignore. That night, as he looked into his glass of whiskey, John felt a weight in his chest. He wanted to believe this was all just a phase. Marriages went through ups and downs, right? At least that's what everyone said. But deep down, he knew something was deeply wrong. And the worst of all was the feeling of helplessness, of not knowing how to fix what was broken. Outside, the sound of tires on gravel announced Melissa's arrival. John glanced at the door, waiting for the familiar click of the key. She entered the room with quick steps, taking off her coat and placing her bag on the sofa. There was a brief exchange of glances, an automatic, emotionless hi, as if they were just two strangers sharing the same roof. "How was the day?" John asked, trying to sound casual even though the tension between them was palpable. "Tiring," Melissa replied, without looking directly at him, as she walked to the kitchen. That brief answer had already become common. It was always the same thing. John wondered if she even realized how far away she was. Or maybe she just didn't care anymore. It was difficult to know what was going through Melissa's head, and this uncertainty was eating him up inside. That night, he decided not to press any further questions. I didn't want to pressure her, not at that moment. They sat at the table, ate dinner in silence, as usual. The words that should have filled that empty space were replaced by the sound of cutlery and the creaking of chairs. John watched Melissa from the corner of his eye, trying to find some trace of the woman he had fallen in love with. She was there, physically, but she seemed to be somewhere else. And this invisible absence was what bothered him most. After dinner, Melissa retired to her room, as she always did. John remained in the room for a while, lost in thought. He knew he couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, but what could he do? Facing the truth seemed too painful a path. He loved Melissa, but love seemed to no longer be enough to keep them connected. As time passed, he began to question his own decisions. Could it have been the work, the extra hours at the company, that kept them away? Had he overlooked the signs that something wasn't right? Doubts formed a storm in his mind, and he felt helpless in the face of what seemed to be the inevitable distance between them. On the other side of the house, in the bedroom, Melissa looked at the mirror, lost in her own thoughts. His eyes reflected a mixture of tiredness and uncertainty. She knew John was trying, knew he still cared. But, there was a barrier between them that she could no longer cross. Sometimes Melissa wondered if it was she who had changed or if it was the world around her that had changed. She had loved John with all her heart. And I still felt something for him, something deep. But over time, that love transformed, became diluted into something different. Maybe it was the weight of expectations, of responsibilities that had arisen over the years. Maybe it was work, which consumed her more and more. Or perhaps it was herself, a different woman than the one John had known. The truth is that when she lay down next to him, she often felt a distance that no words could fill. And this silent loneliness made her question her own choices. Melissa knew that John deserved more, but, at the same time, she felt that she was no longer able to offer what he was hoping for. As silence took over the house, they both struggled with their own emotions, unaware that the fate of their relationship was about to be sealed. What would happen next would change their lives forever, but that night, the only certainty they both shared was doubt about the future. And in that doubt, in the void between them, something was preparing to emerge, something that neither of them was ready to face. The day dawned like any other. John woke up early, as usual, but the weight on his chest wasn't the same as before. Something bothered him deeper, something he could no longer ignore. Melissa had left before him, as she had been doing for the last few weeks, leaving only a vague, "see you later," echoing through the house. Their silent routine was so ingrained that it had become almost unbearable. John decided he couldn't continue with that emptiness. That separation no longer made sense and he was exhausted from wondering where everything had started to fall apart. He needed answers, he needed to understand what was really happening to his wife. The silence between them wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unsettling. It wasn't just a phase, it wasn't just the stress of work. There was something more. Something he still couldn't name, but was about to be revealed. At work, John tried to concentrate on his tasks, but every time his cell phone vibrated, he found himself wondering if it was Melissa. Maybe she had noticed the separation, maybe she wanted to talk, resolve things. But the reality was always the same: work messages, meeting reminders, nothing but an empty routine that no longer met her emotional needs. He spent hours staring at his computer screen, trying to ignore the growing feeling that something was terribly wrong. It was then that he remembered something that had been bothering him for days. The detective he had hired to follow Melissa, almost impulsively, had left a message earlier, but John hadn't had the courage to listen. The phone was still there, on the table, like a reminder that, by pressing that button, your life could change forever. John knew that hearing that message was taking a step toward a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. With a heavy heart, he pressed the play button. The detective's firm voice sounded clear, without any trace of hesitation. "Sir, I have the information you requested. I suggest you see the images I am sending as an attachment. Your wife has been taking off work to meet a man at times and places that hardly leave any doubt about the nature of their relationship." The words cut like a sharp blade. John stopped, unable to process everything at once. He knew deep down that something was wrong, but the confirmation, this concrete pain, was something he didn't know how to deal with. His hands shook as he opened the attachments. Clear photos showed Melissa leaving a restaurant, laughing and talking intimately with another man. There were touches, looks, a closeness that John hadn't seen in months. She was cheating. It was undeniable. John felt like the ground was opening up beneath his feet. What would he do with that information? He could feel the blood running faster through his veins, a mixture of anger and despair rising within him. However, more than that, he felt a sense of humiliation. For weeks, while he worried about the future of their marriage, Melissa was already living a parallel life, a life where he no longer had a place. He left the office abruptly, without even explaining. On the way home, his mind was buzzing with questions and scenarios. Why had she done that? What did the other man have that he didn't have? The memories of the good times, of the promises they made to each other, flashed through John's mind like flashes from a distant movie, something that now seemed almost like a lie. He had dedicated himself so much to that marriage. And now, all of this was reduced to fragments. Back in the empty house, John sat at the kitchen table, staring into space, the sound of the clock echoing through the room. The anger turned into coldness. He knew he needed to take action, but a part of him was still hesitant. Maybe confront her directly. Maybe wait for her to say something. Doubts gnawed at his reasoning, but one thing was clear: he needed to see her, he needed to look into her eyes and confirm if what he felt was true. That night, Melissa didn't come home at the usual time. John knew where she was. The photos, the repeated encounters, he already knew the pattern. And then, almost without realizing it, she picked up the phone and called her lover. There was a morbid curiosity in his mind, a need to know what they did when he wasn't around. "Hello." The male voice sounded surprised. John remained silent for a moment, but then his words came out firm, unshakable: "Tell her I'm getting a divorce." There was a long silence on the other side. He could imagine the shock on their faces. Melissa, of course, was pale, unresponsive. There was no turning back. The betrayal was exposed. The world they had built together, the plans, the dreams, all of it now seemed like a house of cards, about to collapse. John hung up the phone without waiting for answers. He knew Melissa would try to call back, try to explain herself. But he didn't want to hear it. Not at that moment. Explanations wouldn't change the fact that she had made her choice. The pain in his chest was overwhelming, but at the same time, a strange feeling of relief was beginning to emerge. He was no longer trapped in that web of uncertainty. The betrayal had been revealed, and now all that was left was to deal with the consequences. But there was something Melissa still didn't know. Something John had also prepared, something that wasn't just limited to divorce. John was sitting on the couch, his mind still racing after the call he had made to Melissa's lover. Silence dominated the house, but he knew it would soon be interrupted. Melissa was coming back, probably desperate, trying to find a way to fix what was already broken. He knew that the betrayal had been revealed, but there was still something bigger to be resolved. Something she didn't know. Something that would make that moment seem small compared to what was to come. The sound of the door opening echoed through the house, and soon Melissa's footsteps approached. She entered the room, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. His breathing was short, and his expression was a mixture of despair and fear. John sat motionless, staring at her. She hesitated for a moment at the entrance, seeming unsure whether to move closer or keep her distance. "John, please," her voice was weak, almost pleading. "Listen to me. I can explain." He didn't respond. His gaze was cold, distant. Melissa took a few steps forward, holding her hands nervously, trying to find words that could alleviate the situation. I made a mistake," she began, her voice shaking. "I don't know where to start, but you need to understand, I was lost. We were moving away, and I didn't know what to do. Please listen to me." Tears began to stream down her face, but John remained unshakable. She continued to speak, the words coming out in a rush, but he was no longer listening. The apologies were like a distant noise, unable to penetrate the wall he had built around himself. He had spent so long blaming himself, looking for where he had failed, but now it all seemed too clear. She had made her choice, and there was no going back. "This isn't about us, Melissa." John's voice finally broke the silence, dry and hard as a blade. "This is about you. About your decisions." She stopped, her pleading look freezing for a moment, as if her words had hit an insurmountable wall. "I know I hurt you, but I love you. I still love you." Her voice rose in desperation. "We can solve this, John. We can fix everything." "Fix what?" John stood up abruptly, the anger he had been trying to control finally bubbling to the surface. "You betrayed me, Melissa. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. A choice you made over and over while I was here, trying to save something you had already destroyed." "No." She screamed, almost in panic. "It's not like that. I was confused, but I want to be with you. I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean I don't love you." John stared at her, his heart hammering in his chest. Part of him wanted to believe, wanted to hold on to the idea that this was, in fact, a mistake that could be forgiven. But another part, the rational part, knew that nothing would ever be the same. And even worse, he knew that Melissa still had no idea what was really at stake. She still hadn't understood the depth of the abyss she was about to fall into. "Do you think love justifies all this?" His voice sounded more controlled, but still filled with bitterness. "Do you think we can just erase what happened and go back to the way we were before?" Melissa looked at him, tears rolling down her face. She was visibly shaken, her breathing heavy, her body shaking with emotion. And then John knew it was time. It was time to show her that betrayal was just the surface of something much deeper. He took a step forward, approaching her. The room was filled with almost unbearable tension, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. John took his phone out of his pocket and, with a deliberate gesture, threw it onto the coffee table. Melissa looked at the device, confused. "What is that?" she asked, her voice breaking. John kept his gaze fixed on her, without blinking. "That, Melissa, is the evidence. All the photos, the meetings, everything. I knew what you were doing. I hired someone to follow you." His voice was controlled, but each word seemed to stick into Melissa like a knife. She took a step back, as if the impact of the revelation had hit her physically. "John." She began, her voice weak, but he interrupted her. "I knew everything. I saw the photos, I know where you were." He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but the pain in his voice was clear. "The betrayal, the lie, you built it all. And now you're here, wanting to explain yourself, as if that would change anything." Melissa covered her face with her hands, muffled sobs filling the air. She seemed unable to process what was happening, to understand that the game was over. But there was more. John moved even closer, his eyes fixed on her, cold but determined. "But that's not all," he said, with a calm that was more frightening than any scream. "I made my decisions too, Melissa. And I want you to know that it won't just be a divorce." She took her hands off her face, still confused, trying to understand the extent of his words. "What do you mean?" Her voice was almost a whisper. John took a step towards the table, picked up an envelope and opened it, taking out a series of documents. He tossed them onto the table, the crunch of the paper echoing through the room. "I moved all of our money to a separate account. An account of my own," he said, his voice icy. "You won't have anything, Melissa. I made sure of that." She blinked in surprise and took a few seconds to process what he had just said. "What?" she asked, her voice wavering. "John, no. You can't." His expression of disbelief quickly gave way to despair. "You can't do this to me. You can't just leave me with nothing." John crossed his arms, watching as Melissa collapsed before him. "I can, and I did," he replied coldly. "You destroyed our marriage, and now you will pay the price for it." "No." Melissa threw herself towards him, desperate. "John, please. Don't do that. I need you. The words became more frantic, but John didn't move, unshakable in his decision. "It's too late for regrets, Melissa," he said, without emotion. "You made your choices. Now, I'm making mine." The impact of those words seemed to crush any hope Melissa still had. She collapsed to the floor, crying, completely lost. The confident woman John once loved was now reduced to a pile of regret and despair. But, as painful as the moment was, he knew that this was the only way to end that phase of his life. John walked away, leaving Melissa there, on the living room floor. He no longer felt the anger that consumed him hours before. Just a feeling of completion. A feeling of freedom. He knew there was still a lot to resolve. The divorce, the financial details. But at that moment, he had something Melissa would never expect: control. Melissa's cries echoed through the room as John, standing, watched her in complete silence. He had said everything he needed to say, made the decisions he had been putting off for so long. The shock on her face, the despair when she realized that there was nothing left to be saved, was a bitter confirmation that the path he had chosen was the only one possible. But, contrary to what I expected, the feeling of victory didn't come. John felt an uneasiness wash over him as he looked at the woman who had once been the center of his world, now reduced to a fragile figure, sitting on the floor, begging for something that no longer existed. He tried to hold on to the anger that had driven him here, but the heat of that emotion seemed to be slowly dissipating, giving way to emptiness. What came after complete destruction? How was the rubble dealt with? Melissa, still sobbing, struggled to speak. Her voice was broken, choked with anguish, but she continued to try. I don't know what to say," he murmured, with his eyes swollen and his face stained with tears. "I did everything wrong. I know that. But don't leave me like this, John. I can't be without you, not like this." She desperately sought some kind of answer from him, something that could give her a modicum of hope. But John remained motionless, his hands crossed in front of him, in complete silence. The sound of her crying made the atmosphere heavy, as if the air itself was thick with the pain that had settled between them. As he watched her, a part of John wondered at what moment everything truly fell apart. Not when he discovered the betrayal, not when he hired the detective. Perhaps, much earlier, when he was still trying to find solutions, but Melissa had already given up, silently, without him noticing. That question now throbbed in his mind, but the answer seemed unreachable. "What do you want me to do, Melissa?" He finally spoke, his voice tired, without the weight of anger that had driven it before. "There is no turning back. There's nothing more I can do for us." She raised her head, her eyes full of pleading, and shook her head in denial. "No. It can't be like that. You said you loved me, you said we would get through anything, remember?" Her voice rose in desperation. "We can try. I know I messed up, but we can try again. Give me a chance." John looked at her for a few seconds, as if looking for some remnant of who she was before all that. But the truth is, he no longer knew who Melissa was. That woman before him, broken and begging for something that couldn't be given, was no longer the same. And he certainly wasn't either. "I said I loved you, Melissa," he said, feeling the weight of those words. "But love is not enough to fix this. Not after all." She couldn't accept it. The idea of losing everything tormented her. Her body trembled, and she shakily got up from the ground, walking towards him as if the simple act of getting closer could reverse what had been done. "John, please, don't leave me like this. I know I made a mistake, but," she looked at him, trying to hold his hand, but he took a step back, avoiding contact. "I can't do this without you. Not like this." He watched her in silence, seeing the desperation in her eyes. John wanted to believe there was something he could say to calm the storm, but there wasn't. He had spent so long in silence, trying to be strong, trying to find ways to save the marriage. But at that moment, he knew there was nothing left to save. "I'm lost too, Melissa," John admitted, his voice low, full of tiredness. "I thought somehow if I took control, if I confronted you, it would give me some peace. But the truth is, I don't know what to do from now on. What's left isn't enough for both of us." Silence took over the room again as Melissa, still panting, stared at John. The penny finally seemed to be dropping. There was no undoing what was done. The promises, the plans, everything they had built together over the years, were now nothing more than ruins. She felt the ground open beneath her feet, as if she were falling into an abyss she didn't know how to get out of. "And now?" she asked, almost like a whisper. "What happens now?" John took a deep breath, looking at her with a mixture of sadness and resignation. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that, for him, there was no turning back. All that was left was to move on, as best as he could. "Now, we both move on with our lives, separately," he said, firmly. "There is no other choice." Melissa closed her eyes, the tears falling again, but this time, there were no more words. Just the sound of their heavy breathing and the emptiness that surrounded them. They had reached a point of no return, and as much as it hurt, they both knew that was the only possible conclusion. For a moment, the room was silent. Just her heavy breathing, John's restlessness and the sound of the wind outside. The world seemed to have slowed down. John looked down at the table, at the papers he had shown her. Evidence of treason. The evidence that had been necessary for him to finally see the truth. But now, those tests seemed to have a different weight. They not only revealed betrayal, but symbolized the end of something much bigger. And, at the same time, something smaller. The betrayal, however devastating it was not the only reason for the end. It was just the last drop in a cup that had been overflowing for a long time. "I didn't want it to be like this," Melissa murmured, looking at the floor. I never wanted it to end like this. John watched her. He believed her. There was no doubt that on some level she didn't want things to end this way. But the point was that the choices they had made over the years, the mistakes, the silences, the small daily betrayals, all of this had led to that moment. And, as much as they both wanted to go back, there was no longer a way to do so. Finally, he took a deep breath and, with an almost imperceptible nod, turned around, walking towards the door. He knew that if he stayed here, the temptation to try to fix something irreparable might be too strong. And he could no longer afford to continue in a cycle that destroyed him. With his hand on the doorknob, he turned one last time to Melissa. She was still standing still, tears falling silently. There was nothing more to say. Words no longer had power. And so, he left. The cold night wind enveloped him as he left the house, but unlike other times, he didn't feel oppressed by it. It was as if, for the first time in a long time, he could truly breathe. Night had completely fallen when John left the house, leaving Melissa behind in her own despair. The cold wind that passed through him seemed to slowly clear the weight he carried in his chest. That was the end of a long journey. A journey marked by pain, betrayal and silence that now found an end. John drove through the city without a defined direction, just letting his thoughts flow. He knew the worst was over, but he also knew that true healing was still far away. Melissa's betrayal had destroyed something inside him, something that wouldn't be easy to rebuild. But there was, indeed, a feeling of freedom that he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in months, maybe even years, he wasn't trapped in the constant anguish of trying to save a marriage that was already doomed. He parked the car in a random place, looking at the emptiness in front of him. The future seemed uncertain, but he also knew that this time, it would be a future built by his own choices. There would no longer be the weight of doubt or distrust. All that was left now was to move forward, even if that meant walking a path alone for a while. While John reflected, Melissa remained alone in the house. The silence, which had once seemed like an invisible barrier between the two, was now an overwhelming presence. The tears continued to fall, but as time passed, they began to lose their intensity. Desperation gave way to a deep feeling of emptiness. She knew John wouldn't come back. She knew he wouldn't forgive her and that things would never be the same as before. And deep down, Melissa couldn't blame him. She slowly got up from the floor, feeling the weight of the choices she had made. The promises he broke, the lies he told, and the irreparable damage he caused. Everything hit her with a force she had never imagined. For the first time, perhaps, she truly understood the impact of her actions. And in that realization, there was a pain that she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. Looking at the documents John had left on the table, Melissa clearly saw what was coming. Divorce, the end of everything. But what terrified her most was the idea of having to start over alone, without the stability that John had always offered. Everything she knew was falling apart, and the reality of having lost not only her husband, but also the security he provided, left her on the verge of panic. With shaking hands, she tried to organize her thoughts, but nothing seemed to make sense. The betrayal that seemed, at the time, a momentary escape from his dissatisfaction, now revealed itself as the beginning of the end. And now, what was left? She knew John had taken everything from her, and legally, there was nothing she could do to dispute it. The prospect of having to face the world alone, without money, without the comfort her marriage had provided, was too frightening to accept. On the other side of town, John stopped in front of a small bar. It was a simple, discreet place where he knew he could disappear for a few hours. He went in, ordered a drink, and sat at the back, away from prying eyes. As he held the glass in his hands, he thought about everything that had happened. He knew that, however much relief was present, the future would bring new challenges. Rebuilding your life without Melissa, dealing with loneliness, relearning to trust someone. But at that moment, he was at peace with the decision he had made. Her betrayal had not only destroyed their marriage, but also the person he was by her side. Now, he had a chance to find himself again. Back at home, Melissa did the only thing that seemed to make sense. She picked up the phone and tried to call her lover. Maybe, in some way, he could be your support point, your refuge. But, to his surprise, the link went straight to voicemail. Again, she tried, but the answer was the same. It was as if the ground was opening up once again beneath his feet. Her lover, the person she had risked everything with, was also not there when she needed him most. The hours dragged by, and Melissa realized, with painful clarity, that she was truly alone. The man she had cheated on John with was not a solution, just an illusion. And now, with her husband out of her life and her lover gone, she found herself facing emptiness. The weight of her actions felt greater than anything she could carry alone. That same night, John finished his drink and left the bar. He knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was in control of his own life. He had the power to decide what came next. And that, in itself, was a huge step. Melissa, on the other hand, was still in the house, sitting alone on the couch, staring into space. The future she had imagined had crumbled before her eyes. And now, without John, without her lover, and without the comfort of before, all that was left was regret. A regret that, she knew, would follow her forever. The end came silently but devastatingly. John went on his way, free to rebuild his life, while Melissa was left stuck with the consequences of her own choices. She had lost everything, and now, she would have to face what she feared most, the reality that sometimes the price of betrayal is greater than anyone can pay. And you, what did you think of this story? Leave your comment, we want to know your opinion. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more impactful stories like this. Here, we never support any form of cheating, as we believe that truth and loyalty are fundamental in any relationship.